Thank you, Renee, and welcome everybody. I know this is a Friday afternoon and not a fun topic for Friday afternoons, but we did say we would get back to you with an update before the end of the month, and being conscious of Monday being end of quarter, we decided to go ahead and have this call this afternoon and to bring you up to date with our latest status around the transition from LIBOR. So you will see on the agenda slide that we'll talk about some of the key points that have been happening with the ARRC committee, what their next steps are, and open transition questions. And then we'll talk and give you an update about the status of AFS Level 3 and AFSVision and our ability to support this transition today and in the future. And then we'll talk about what our next steps would be. Have a few reminders at the back of the slides. We'll make these available to you after the call to help with some of the terminology and explanations. So I'm going to go ahead and move on to talk about the ARRC Operations Working Group, and I realize now that the name of the group seems to change. Originally it was the Business Loan Operations Working Group, and then the Business Working Group or Working Operations Group, whichever they are. So certainly AFS is very much involved. We've been attending the on-site meetings in New York City. There was a 2-day session in August, and then we just recently had a 2-day session in September. We have meetings also scheduled for October and November, although I think we were all hoping that we would have a lot more finalization of the LIBOR transition by this time and not have to go into October, certainly not into November, but that is where we are. So we talked in this last working group meeting on the 17th and 18th, and we have representation from the Fed, from the ARRC, obviously from the major banks and loan system vendors. One of the updates we received is that the Fed is planning to have SOFR rates published with a forward-looking term of 30, 90, and 180 days, and expect that these rates will start to be published sometime in the first half of 2020. Another thing that the working group has been looking at is what changes might be necessary to customer statements, billing statements, and syndication notices. So the major software vendors got together in separate meetings and came to an agreement on what additional data fields would be added to support some of the new interest, or the one new interest calculation method, which is the compounding in arrears. So I'll come back to compounding, but to know that we believe we have the definition of what additional data fields will need to appear on these notices based on doing the compounding in arrears. There's also been questions about how the rates are rounded or how many decimal places the rates will go out to. We did not come to final agreement on those and decided that that would be deferred until subsequent meeting. We know today that AFS systems support up to 8 decimal places on interest rate fields. The compounded in arrears interest rate is, of course, the big challenge because this is calling for some new functionality, I think, for any loan system that we're aware of. And so one of the focus points of this meeting in September was to go through actual use cases, and AFS took the lead in developing these use cases and presenting them to the group so that we could work through them. And in going through the use cases, we determined first that there were actually at least 2 different methods for doing compounded interest, and we reference here old math and new math, and that just means we were going along original, assumptions about how compounding rates would work, and then in the last few weeks there was introduced a different method. Hence, we in the working group have come to call it the old math and the new math. That's the only reason we're using that terminology. Um, also, with compounded in arrears interest, we're talking about really doing a daily interest with a rate that changes daily, and that is presenting challenges to operationalize around a look-back period and a lockout period. And this is all about knowing the rate in advance to know when the borrower wants to borrow, and also being able to produce a billing statement in advance of the end of the period or the due date. Hence, do we need to be able to look back for rates kind of like LIBOR today that has a built-in 2-day look back? And do we need a lockout because the rates can change every day? If you want to produce the bill in advance, you need to then lock down that rate change for those last few days once the bill's been created. So there's a lot of talk about that, but it also depends somewhat on what the math is going to be for the compounding in arrears, hence still looking for final definition on that. It also, this compounding in arrears raised questions around loan sales and trading, because if you're compounding interest over a period and then some party buys into that loan in the middle of that period, you need to determine what their share of a compounded interest calculation would be. And again, there have been different opinions as to how that should be calculated. There's also been talk about publishing a compounded rate, and could this be beneficial? But again, there are questions about publishing a daily compounded rate, because the compounding is based on how many days has the borrowing been going for. So these are questions, unfortunately, that still have not gotten final answers from the working group, let alone the ARRC, who will make the final recommendations. So the next steps for the ARRC would be obviously to reach agreement on the compounded and arrears mathematics. And again, there is a meeting scheduled for the third week in October in New York City, where we would hope to come to finalization. And then the ARRC committee also has introduced a new question, which is, given the complexities around operationalizing this compounded in arrears, does it make sense for the banks or the industry to move forward in a phased approach so that of the 4 SOFR conventions, the compounding in arrears could be moved to a later phase, and the markets could focus on doing the other 3 SOFR conventions and have them operationalized sooner? Now, the loan working group has been asked to provide feedback on this phased approach. They've been asked to provide that by the 4th of October, and then the working group would create a final draft by the 18th so that that could be presented to the full ARRC committee at their next scheduled meeting, which is October 22nd. Again, we'll give you copies of the slide so that you know I'm throwing a lot of dates at you, so you'll be able to track those dates. The ARRC committee is targeting now January of 2020 to have all the final recommendations done. So again, that leaves us still with several open points for this transition. So certainly working through use cases for the 4 SOFR rate methods. As we said, 3 of those 4 rate methods, they're included in the appendix, AFS loan systems support today, both AFS Level 3 and AFSVision. They will support those 3 methods, and it's only the compounding arrears method that remains to be defined. So the other methods include a forward-looking term and a SOFR rate compounded in advance, and a simple daily SOFR rate, much like a daily LIBOR rate. So we will be providing, I'll talk in a future slide, we'll be providing updates on those 3 methods as to how they are currently supported today. But a question then would be, is the industry going to go to a phased approach and defer the compounding and arrears until a later time? Also, as an open transition point, are the LIBOR fallback instructions. still to be communicated to the market and operationalized by 2021. So the language in the credit agreements and so forth, the ARRC committee is providing guidance for that. Additional discussions have included the talk about having a credit spread adjustment. So what will happen is when, on a given day, when LIBOR ceases to be published, if the credit agreement has to fall back to a SOFR rate, then it would seem at this point SOFR rates could be materially different than what that LIBOR rate is on that day. So the Fed will be publishing and a spread adjustment, which will in effect bring the SOFR rate comparable to what the LIBOR rate for that period of time. So any of those borrowings or loans that actually are going to default from a LIBOR rate to a SOFR rate in the middle of their term, there will be a credit spread adjustment provided that can be used to keep those rates comparable. And then to that, you would still then add your normal margin based on the credit risk of the borrower. Again, open questions that the ARRC committee has on our list is how to get to the forward-looking SOFR term curve, and there's talk about the industry perspective on this, and then lastly, this compounded SOFR, how are we compounding? And that gets into the new math, old math questions that I mentioned earlier. So now we're moving on to slide 6 and the status of where we are AFS with respect to level 3 and AFSVision. So again, today the both systems have the ability to support 3 of the 4 SOFR rate conventions. As I said, the compounded in advance, forward-looking term, and daily simple SOFR rate in arrears. These would operate very much today using the index rate functionality that exists in both level 3 and AFSVision. The compounded in arrears, again, is still an in-process for AFS. We have indicated our target is to have whatever code enhancements are needed to have them ready to be delivered to our client banks by the end of first quarter of 2020. There's certainly a lot of pressure now brought on the banks from the regulators to have their systems ready as soon as possible. And we certainly will be supporting that. But of course, the compounding in arrears, given that it still doesn't have a final definition of how to do the calculations, it's holding us up from finalizing our development to support that. Once those final decisions are made, we can complete the development necessary and provide you with further updates of what type of code changes might be required for this compounding in arrears and how it would be delivered. For those who run the AFS software in-house, we would be looking to provide you with a code update that the banks could individually apply and then obviously go through your testing period. For those banks where AFS is hosting the system, whether it's level 3 or AFSVision, AFS would coordinate with each of our hosted clients for the proper timing of applying any code updates to their respective systems. We noted here that as a sub-bullet that AFS will, of course, have consulting services available, as we always do to our clients, to assist in implementation or testing work that needs to be done. And this would be available on an individual client-by-client basis. And you would work with AFS and contact us separately as to what type of assistance that you might require. We're going to provide the code updates, the functionality that's needed in the systems. We'll provide the comparable documentation, user guide updates that would go along with those types of changes. And that would be automatically provided by AFS. The consulting services would be something that would be arranged separately and according to normal terms of each client's agreement. An additional topic around the SOFR implementation, or really here we call it the alternative reference rates, because we know when you get into the foreign markets, there's going to be equivalents to SOFR like SONIA in the UK and ESTR in Europe, is that there is a request for additional data fields in the loan system around this transition. So we've identified that we would add a data fields, or the ability to track data fields for a fallback approach indicator. For those who are close to this, they know there's a hardwired approach or other approaches, an indicator on each obligation to indicate what the credit agreement calls for. Certainly, what would the fallback indexed rate be and method? So if it's going to fall back to SOFR, is it compounded in advance, compounded in arrears? So you would want the ability to indicate that on each obligation. I mentioned the credit spread adjustment, which would want to be tracked. That would be published at the time of LIBOR cessation. And we've also looked at the same time of putting in indicators around negative rates and language in your credit agreements for negative rates. Now, I'm going to digress a little bit from LIBOR SOFR when I say negative rates. Bringing that up because we're getting a lot of questions, because I believe you're getting questions from the regulators, or anticipating questions from the regulators around negative rates. So we know that AFS today, AFSVision supports the negative rate processing that we're seeing in the market, and especially over in Europe and other markets. And for level 3 as well, we have made available updates to our level 3 clients that would need to support index rates going negative. From a calculation standpoint, we know that both level 3 and Vision can calculate negative accruals. There are certainly a lot of operational questions around what do you do if a loan is accruing negative interest, and how that affects billing and other areas. So that's something that we are continuing to look at, but I wanted to make sure that people were aware of our position today to support the negative rate environment that might be coming here to the U.S. markets. And we're going to look for client feedback to see if there are other data fields that would need to be added in both AFS Level 3 and AFSVision to support the LIBOR transition. From a notice and invoice standpoint, as I said earlier, we think today, by us supporting 3 of the 4 SOFR methods, we have the appropriate information on the notices, invoices to support those processes. The compounding in arrears will require some additional data fields to be added to those notices and invoices. So again, once the compounding in arrears calculation is finalized, we can give you a time schedule as to the updates for notices and invoices that would be needed in the AFS systems. So the next steps for AFS is that we will be distributing user guide updates for how to process the 3 SOFR methods that I referenced today that are currently supported in both Level 3 and AFSVision. So we will provide details to each of you to see how the system would work today, leveraging our current indexed rate functionality. AFS will continue to attend the ARRC working group sessions. We will continue to schedule updates like the one we're having today to let you know of any new developments, decisions, and so forth. At the same time, we're in the process of developing changes that are needed. You know, currently we're focused on the new fields and the ability to track those, but certainly the development of compounded and arrears, we are anxious to get that finished once we have the final definition. And then we will talk in more detail about how these code changes would be delivered to each of the clients. A couple reminders around the transition from an overall industry standpoint. Obviously, I think you are all in the process of identifying the impact of moving from LIBOR pricing positions to SOFR or other alternative rates. Certainly the Treasury groups are looking very carefully about what the financial impact is to each institution. I know you're also working on documentation, credit agreements, and being sure that they are updated appropriately. Again, the current plan is for LIBOR to cease on or about 12/31 of 2021. We're hearing it's either going to be December 31st or January 2nd of 2022. If anyone hears any changes to those dates that we haven't heard about, appreciate you letting us know. But I think that's where the whole industry is marching towards those deadlines. And obviously having, what we're in the middle of now is making sure that we have the operational readiness to support the changes that are coming along. So I went through all that. We wanted to wait and allow questions to come following this. I know we have a large group of people on the phone, so in order to manage the questions, as Renee said, you can support those online.
Yes, so please use the chat area to the left, and you can pose your questions there, and we'll respond to them. Thank you.
So one of the questions is about the credit spread adjustment and how is that going to be calculated. Honestly, I don't know how they're actually going to come up with a calculation. We know that it will be published. And so for any given loan, at that point in time, there will be a published credit spread adjustment that gets used for the duration of that loan or the duration of that pricing tranche. So as I understand, the banks will not have to figure out the spread adjustment or calculate it. It will be something that is provided. So it will be a matter, so those that know AFS in more detail, we have the ability to do derived index rates. So you could take the daily SOFR and then add a credit spread adjustment if it's 150 basis points or whatever, and that would be an adjusted SOFR rate that could then be used. So you wouldn't have to continue to update that credit spread adjustment. You would establish that one time for those borrowings, and the system through the derived rate processing would automatically to maintain that spread adjustment. I think there are still questions about will there be any additional charges to our customers for these changes. At this point, no. AFS is providing whatever changes are necessary to each of our clients. And again, if you are a licensed client, we'll be providing the code updates so that you can apply them yourselves. If we are hosting the AFS system, whether it's level 3 or Vision, if AFS is hosting it, AFS would obviously apply the changes and work with each of you as to when those changes would be provided to your testing environments, because you're going to want to go through the testing, and then when they agree to a coordinated date of when they would get applied in production. I know there are questions about the compounding and arrears and when do we need answers from the ARRC to make our target date of first quarter of 2020. I think we had said before that the end of September was our target date to have those. Unfortunately, the September meetings have not reached finalization. So we are going to still push for our first quarter date as much as possible, but it's going to be subject to those outside forces as to when finalization occurs. We're doing work now as what we can and what we know, but there becomes a point where you can't finish the code development until you have those final definitions. So again, I know there's a push to have them sooner, and certainly we're aware of that and working as best we can given those circumstances. So again, the timing, we're still looking at first quarter of 2020 for having code available, but then that is both Level 3 and AFSVision. If there are updates required, it would be in that time period. Bear with me, I am reading some of the questions that are coming in. So I know there's questions about the rates and how they are determined. Again, they are going to be published by the Fed. Actually, if you go out today to the internet and you Google daily SOFR rates, it will take you to the Fed website where you can see what the SOFR daily rate is each day. Now remember that SOFR rates are a little unique because they're based on the overnight fundings that occurred the day before in the repo market. Effectively, today's SOFR rate isn't published until tomorrow morning at 8:30. And in fact, it is subsequent to revision up until 3 p.m. of that next day. So SOFR rates are always going to be, as we think, a day behind. So the challenge there is if today I'm a borrower and I want to borrow at SOFR and I call the bank, what would my rate be today? The bank would have to say, I'll let you know tomorrow by at the latest 3 o'clock tomorrow what your rate would be today. Now we know that you're not going to book a loan today and not have the rate. That's why the look back period it seems to be the logical way to deal with that. But then there became a question of how far of a look back you have to take into account weekends, holidays, and so forth. And right now, the ARRC committee is looking at a 5 business day look back. So if I were the borrower and I wanted to borrow money today at SOFR, the bank would look at what the SOFR rate was 5 business days prior to today and say, here's what your SOFR rate would be today. And again, depending on what method you're going to use, is it a forward-looking term, then it would be that rate for the next 30 days, kind of like LIBOR works. But if it's going to be done on a daily basis, such as with compounding, then I'm going to say, here's what your SOFR rate is today. Tomorrow it'll be a different rate. The next day it'll be a different rate for their 30 days of that borrowing, or the 90 days, or the 180 days, whatever that would be. So I think if anybody's doing like daily LIBOR today, I know some banks offer some products where it's tied to LIBOR, but you actually change the rate each day on the loan based on that daily LIBOR. It would be similar to something like that. And as I said, the challenges are not just with the look back to know what your rate really is the first day, but then as you approach the end of the borrowing period, when you want to provide a statement to the borrower as to how much interest they owe, you don't want the rate to keep changing for the last 3 or 4 days, after you've already sent them the bill, which is why they're talking about, having whether you'd have to do a lockout period if you weren't going to do a look back. So the look back lockout they're almost like one or the other, and the ARRC group, the working group, is still, I think, trying to determine what makes the most sense operationally to support that. Again, I think a question about, are there code updates for the first 3 methodologies? No, those first 3 methodologies can be done today. We'll be providing over the next couple of weeks more detailed documentation to show you how they're supported today in both AFS Level 3 and in Vision. The only additional code updates for those first 3 would be if you were going to track additional data fields and how we might add those additional data fields, again, in Level 3 based on what release you're on versus how we'll add them into Vision going forward. And as far as samples of calculations of those 3 options, that would be part of the documentation that we'll provide. Okay, so you'll have, I think, clear examples of how to support each one of those 3 methodologies that you can do today. Questions about the rate calculation for compounding in arrears. Again, that rate, well, the calculation of interest is going to be done within AFS, whether it's level 3 or vision. It will be another type of accrual. We'll leverage what we have there today. We just need the finalization about how that compounding calculation is actually going to work back to the old math or new math option. But you won't have to go out to a separate system or somewhere to get that calculation. It will be within AFS so that you know that AFS will offer our standard for accounting precision and accuracy, as well as general ledger and billing. So that's why we're being very careful as we develop this to make sure it meets the AFS standards for being able to support, as I said, the accuracy that's necessary. That would include, things like backdating and adjustments and so forth. So it's easy to say we can just support some new calculation, but you've got to make sure you support it under all those different scenarios, be able to support the backdating, effective dating, adjustments to general ledger, whatever might need to be done. Now, because this compounding and arrears calculation is different than a daily simple interest that we do today, that's why we've been working on changes to the billing statement, because the borrower is going to need some additional information to be able to validate the interest that you're telling them that they owe. Again, that's part of some of the operational challenges. And then if you've been in any of these working group meetings, we've had some pretty lively discussions about this compounding in arrears. It's somewhat complicated. And I've heard banks say, if we can't even figure it out here in this room, how's our borrower going to understand how the bank calculated the proper interest? So part of that is we have to put the right data fields on the billing statement so they can see how that's being calculated. But it's still going to be a challenge because it's a new way to do things. And the history goes back to, and I'll editorialize a little bit, this goes back to January of this year when this was all talked about, and there were a lot of questions raised about compounding and arrears and why do we want to do this and so forth. And the ARRC committee sent this proposal out for comment from the banks, and what we're being told from the ARRC is that the banks said they want to be able to support compounding and arrears. I know one of the main arguments for it is for hedging purposes, that compounding and arrears offers the ability to do a perfect hedge because your derivative products are calculated in that way. But derivative products are not loan products, so they don't have the same operational challenges of how do you tell the borrower how much money they owe and how do you send them a bill in advance and all those other operational issues. But that's how it evolved into this new thing called compounding and arrears. And I know as more people get into the discussion, at some point somebody always says again, well, why are we even doing this? Well, we're doing it because the ARRC committee got feedback from the banks that said they want to be able to support this method. So as a result, AFS is committed to providing you that ability to do that support. And again, this could happen midstream. We realize that a loan could be accruing at LIBOR for 15 days, and then the final 15 days of the month, it could switch over to a SOFR compounded. So obviously your billing statement is going to show one set of calculations for the first 15 days and another set for the last 15 days. That's what we would be looking to do. I think we're winding down on questions. I see a question about negative rates, and I'm going to wait and come back to that, see if we can finish most of our questions about SOFR. We've talked about additional data fields. So the question of how are we going to add those data fields, like increasing the obligation file size. Admittedly, we're going to look, because we see these fields as informational only. We're going to look for a place where these fields can be like in AFSVision, because of its relational design, there may be a separate table connected to the obligation table where we store those. In level 3, we're going to look at some other places, because we know with level 3 there's different challenges with the database structure and where we can put those. One option might be to use a tickler record, and you can designate which tickler type it would be represented, and that's where you could store that type of information. There are questions about other alternative reference rates like Ameribor or others, and we've looked at those. So far, to the extent they appear to be like any other indexed rate, and as long as they have a forward-looking term structure, then we can certainly support those. We can support those today without any changes. There are some questions about mass migration. So right now we're looking at providing data fields so that you would know on any given contract what the fallback rate would be if it needs to be changed. Now, I think we believe realistically a lot of your contracts are going to change prior to that magic date at the end of 2021 when LIBOR goes away. So most borrowers, when they go to negotiate their next pricing or their repricing, we think you're going to see transitions away from LIBOR sooner than that. When it comes to the actual change itself, we know you're going to want us to track on each loan record what the fallback index rate would be to replace LIBOR, but how that change would get done, I think, is going to be with each client as they determine how they would make those changes. You know, we've looked before in our loan products about fallback rates, and I think today most of your credit agreements, if you offer LIBOR, they have language in them that says if the LIBOR price stops because the borrower hasn't told the bank what they want to roll over to, the language would say you can default to prime. We've never put that in as an automatic process, because what we're told is invariably, if for some reason the borrower doesn't tell the bank on the day that they want to roll over their 30-day LIBOR to another 30 days, they don't want the system to switch it to prime, because the next day or the day after, when the bank and the borrower finally talk, the borrower says, oh, I wanted to roll over to another 30-day LIBOR. The bank's going to make that change. So rather than have it default to prime and change it back, our position has always been to let the banks make that change individually. We're going to give you a data field where you can know what that fallback index should be and method, but not making the changes automatically. So we're welcome to get more feedback about that. Again, questions about the user guide updates. I think we said about 2 weeks that we would look to be able to get that out to you. We have most of that compiled today. We're just going through some final review to make sure of that. Okay. Yeah, I think I got that. So then there was one question about negative rates again. And hold on, let me check this question. So first of all, there's two answers on negative rates. AFSVision does have the ability to support negative values in their data fields. So AFSVision, those clients, they have the ability to do negative rates today. Level 3 in its architecture did not originally have an ability to track a negative number in a field like the rate field. So when this came up for the first time a couple of years ago, we did talk to the level 3 clients about this, and we had a few of the banks get together and say, yes, we want to have changes done in level 3 to support negative index rates. And we developed those changes, and those banks that participated, they each individually contributed towards the cost of the development of those changes. So going forward, if additional banks are going to look to get those updates in level 3, we would look to provide you with what the cost would be to get you those updates. And again, you can each talk to your individual RM or contact if you have further questions about that. And that's the ability, again, to support the negative index rates, seeing the indexes go below 0. At the time we looked at this with our clients, we talked about the all-in rate on the loan going below 0, and every one of our clients said no, they would never have a need for the loan itself to be accruing on a negative basis. If you're watching the news, you're seeing over in the EU that there are, I think now, actually some loan products that are carrying a negative rate. So we realized that we can do that. Level 3 does have a negative memo item, which allows you to accrue as a negative number. Again, there's lots of operational challenges around that. If you've got an amortized payment, how do you do that when the interest portion is negative and so forth? Some of those details would need to be worked out if, in fact, you really are going to need to support the all-in rate going below 0. But you can calculate that today. You have that ability in level 3, whatever version you're on, through the use of negative memo items. So if the regulator is talking to you about that and can your loan system support, doing a negative accrual, you can certainly tell them that it does have that support. The ability to do the negative index rates and the other parts, again, that's the additional code updates that could be made available to you, and you need to contact us individually for that. Again, the feeling is the indexes could go negative, but when you apply the spread or the margin, it would be we would think it'd be very unlikely that the all-in rate on the loan would go negative. Now, if you get to some of the larger credits where your margins are much thinner, there is that possibility. And so that would be, you'd have the options in level 3 to use the negative memo item if you need to do that. That way you can get the negative accrual, you can get it into general ledger and so forth. There would just have to be some work out about the billing process, really, what you want to do with the borrower. And we would certainly be looking for more guidance from each of you as to how you would expect that should process if you're accruing a negative interest amount with respect to billing and amortization. Well, probably if it continues to be important enough, we maybe could even arrange a separate webcast where we could devote specifically to the negative rates. Okay. Again, what most banks are trying to do is make sure that they have language in their credit agreement with a floor that it would say that the floor is 0, which would prevent you from ever having to have a negative all-in interest rate. And in fact, part of the updates we've offered to level 3 clients have the ability to put a 0 floor on the index itself, or let the index go negative, but on the loan prime schedule, put a floor of 0 there, so that even if the index is negative and when you apply your margin, you're still at an all-in negative, we would cap it at 0 for the accrual on the loan itself for the interest portion. Okay. All right, I think we've reached the end of our questions. Again, I know some of you have reached out to us individually. You can continue to do that. We hope that this is beneficial to talk to all of you and give you a general update of where we are. We're anxious to get the final definitions from the ARRC so that we can finalize those coding changes around the compounding and arrears and the additional data fields that you might need to store some of the information on your loan records. So we're looking forward to getting that done and be able to get the code out to you so that you can all check off that box and say you're in compliance and ready to move forward. So We thank you very much. Enjoy the rest of your day and enjoy the weekend, and we'll be back in touch shortly. Thank you.